Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have a great privilege today to host a special guest, a good friend of mine, Michael Bьорд, who currently resides in Romania, in Bucharest, but he originally came from Britain. He visited on different occasions Ukraine. He supported Ukraine. He volunteered for Ukrainian refugees when the full-scale Russian invasion started back in February last year. And also, Michael is a very experienced journalist who has a dedicated team which work on different projects, and also projects which devoted to the corruption of Russian authorities. And their crimes on occupied territories. So, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, Michael, let's start with, let's say, the cultural aspects. You came from Britain. You still work for different media outlets in Britain, United States. You live in Romania, in Eastern Europe. So what is the main difference between Western Europe and, let's say, Britain, which represents, let's say, an age of, let's say, Western Europe, yeah, and Eastern Europe? What, let's say, practical difference do you see? Because we understand there is a cultural difference, but practical difference in terms of, let's say, life understanding, moral, with the way things happen, etc. Please.
Well, I don't think there's a huge difference. And I think a lot of I don't think there's a kind of, there is a difference in the kind of people that are in different parts of Europe. What I think's interesting now is in the past, there was this notion that you had Western Europe, which was sort of civilized and kind of, forward and advanced, and Eastern Europe, which was somehow backward. This was this kind of cliche that used to exist in the past. And you often saw countries such as Poland or the Czech Republic or Hungary even sort of saying, we don't want to be called Eastern European because of this stigma. We want to be Central European. Okay. And I think that maybe there should be a movement to say we're never going to get away from the Eastern European stigma. Maybe we should look at things geographically and say, okay, you have Western Europe, you have Central Europe, and Central Europe should be this kind of idea of New Europe, what people prefer to call New Europe in some ways, which could be the kind of new states which are part of the EU or contending to be part of the EU. And that should be, if you like, the kind of heart of Europe in some ways, and forward-thinking Europe. And I think that those countries are the ones who've recently joined the EU in the last 20 years.
Michael, let's talk about double moral, which actually I find very serious, especially in Western Europe. I will give you an example. During the last 15 years, here in Ukraine, we heard that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO, not only because before the full-scale invasion, we didn't have, let's say, a majority support for NATO, but we actually did have for European Union. But the main reason why Ukraine did not fit, let's say, NATO size was the fact of corruption. Because of corruption, you have to deal with corruption, etc. But let's speak straight. In Romania, there is also corruption. In Czech Republic, there is corruption. In Poland, there is corruption. So I have many Romanian, Polish, Czech friends who actually prove this, and actually in Croatia, corruption as well. So actually, what West did, West blackmailed Ukraine, did not allow to enter NATO, and at the end of the day, it led to the Russian invasion. Okay, Ukraine obviously will fight back territories. So this is a matter of time, but Ukraine lost many people, who actually could still be alive if NATO committed rightly and allowed Ukraine to join NATO. So do you see that there is a serious double moral now in Western politics when we talk about this, or when we talk about political correctness when, let's say, political correctness becomes the kind of censorship?
Well, I think you've got a few issues there. I mean, on the one hand, yes, I mean, you see corruption everywhere. You see it in the UK, obviously. You see it in America. You see aspects of corruption everywhere. And I think that what maybe the difference is a certain public perception. And I think that in Romania, for example, what you've seen that as it became a member of the EU, the country had to transform so many parts of its public administration and its education, health sector to try and eliminate aspects of corruption and put a lot of people in prison. And that kind of was one of the ways that it stopped being monitored by the EU for its some of the issues, and it managed to unlock some EU funds because of that. And that's something where you see the beneficial aspects of EU membership. It becomes a kind of carrot and stick way of being able to assist in a country in trying to become more transparent and open and less corrupt. And I think that model could potentially work with Ukraine. I'm not saying, it could work with Ukraine, certainly in assisting in some of it. Now, is there a double standard? It's possibly there is. But in terms of the public perception, certainly in Romania, there is this perception that things are not as corrupt as they were 20 years ago. And I know that having been in Ukraine, spent time there, spoken to a lot of people there, it does, before the war, let's say, certainly before the full-scale invasion, it did seem that there were a lot of problems which Romania had been experiencing, certainly in public administration and healthcare in particular. And that's the kind of thing that possibly the EU could help with, and I think we're quite willing to help.
Yeah, Michael, I agree with you that in Ukraine, obviously, Ukrainian people faced different, let's say, examples of corruption as everywhere, maybe more, because Ukraine is a post-Soviet state, especially used to be before the full Russian invasion, the scale invasion. But as you said, when Romania got inside European Union, Romania had to adjust to EU standards which existed at the time. So it was a great motivation for Romania to adjust itself to EU standards and NATO standards, because Romania was already inside there. Maybe this is actually a great mistake on behalf of European Union and NATO. Let's take an example of Georgia. Yeah, Georgia, I think it's even more prominent example. We see now that even though there is a democratic parliament there, still we have a sample of usurpation of power by the ruling party. And the Saakashvili is imprisoned, and actually what now the Georgian government tries to do, tries to restore its relations with Russia. Yeah. So EU and NATO failed to bind closer Georgia. Yeah. So maybe this is a problem. I don't know how to call it, double moral or lack of leadership. Maybe.
I think you even have more examples of that, and that's the West Balkans. I mean, I think that the idea of the EU holding this kind of, you can be a member in the future. You can be a member in the future to countries such as Montenegro, Serbia, and North Macedonia. If you do this, if you do that, and then everything's kind of on pause, or Albania, or everything's kind of delayed a little bit, and that is to do a lot of the time with internal politics within each EU member state. It tends to be because France or Germany a little bit worried that if they let in more countries, it might infuriate the far right. They also have this consensus issue, so they're afraid maybe countries which are a little bit more rogue within the EU, like Poland or Hungary, might put a stop on things and say, no, we can't expand anymore right now. So that tends to be for those reasons. Having said that, I don't think it's fair. And it's certainly not fair on the West Balkans, and it's certainly not fair on countries like Georgia, because what it does is it creates this atmosphere of this mistrust between the EU and these countries, where they feel that they're not being promised what they were offered in the past. And I think that that's something which the EU knows. I think but they're not really doing enough about it. And I think that one of the interesting things about what has happened in the last 2 years is that things which were not on the EU agenda before, such as Ukraine membership or Moldova membership in particular, have suddenly kind of been brought to the forefront. They've become an issue. And there seems to be a growing consensus about opening up procedures for them. But of course, if you're in Georgia, or if you're in Serbia, or if you're in Montenegro or North Macedonia, or Albania, you might feel a little bit annoyed because they're kind of jumping the queue a little bit here. So there is all of these things you have to take into consideration at once. Having said that, I think that what we've saw with the initial expansion into Eastern Europe or Central Europe over the last 20 years is that it has been beneficial to every single country within that sphere. I don't think you can say, having been to all of those countries, I don't think I can go anywhere and say, find people who realistically say we want to go back to the Soviet model or even the Yugoslav model. It's not really desired by, and I think that shows that if the EU was to expand to these other countries, it does have a model that does seem to function. So I think that it can be something which should happen. The issue with the EU is always timing. When should it happen? How should it happen? Is it better to give people incentives against things like corruption before they're in the bloc or after they're in the bloc? There's these kind of issues which people are sort of put into debate. And that's kind of the discussions that are happening at the moment. Yeah.
I recently used to speak to one prominent Ukrainian politician who has many friends in Romania, among top political figures in Romania, and he actually is very fascinated about the way how Romania during the last 10 years fought the corruption. It's true, because actually Ukraine copied in some way, let's say, the special police forces which were created to fight corruption in Romania. So Ukraine copied its experience under the Poroshenko regime. Now it continues. We have NABU, etc. But actually, what I find interesting from what I heard is that now some Romanian officials, they're actually afraid to adopt decisions at all. So what they're trying to do, they try to postpone, or they try to pass this decision to some other official, like hot pastry, because they're afraid of adopting decision, because at the end of the day, they will be scrutinized by special police anti-corruption forces, which will try to find, let's say, a lips of corruption there. Yeah. So is here a problem when, let's say, trying to fight corruption, we at the same time converting top officials to people which try to avoid adopting decisions?
You mean, in other words, does it get to a situation whereby people are too afraid to make decisions because they take responsibility?
Yeah.
It might, I mean, in some cases it might be the situation, but I think in that, what that needs is, it needs transparency. It needs, if you like, people to come out and say that, and to sort of have an open discussion about these issues. Look, and I think that there should be a forum for people to be able to say that, and that's an indication of a democracy. It's like, okay, you could go in the whole other direction whereby you become completely zero tolerance for all forms of corruption. Okay, well then let's have a discussion about whether or not we're going in that direction, and that way you show that you have an open society. That way you show that people are not afraid to speak out. And I think that's probably an example of what you said, where hopefully things are going to. they're kind of leading to that area at the moment. I hope so, but it's not perfect, not in any way.
I read an article in a recent volume of Foreign Affairs, a very prominent journal, you know, this which let's say is very popular not among ordinary people but among elite, who adopt decisions. And the author states that unfortunately now we have more divided world than we used to have. So obviously, being an Ukrainian and you being a British, but residing in Romania, we look on the world through the lens of, for instance, Russian invasion into Ukraine, the future of European Union, the future of, let's say, Brexit or proposed Brexit, etc. Yeah, or what will happen in the United States in case Biden loses the elections. But at the same time, we have, let's say, many more states which now pretend to become members of Security Council of the United Nations, which have their own interests, which have their own agenda, and let's speak straight, which are not really interesting about what is happening to Europe. In Europe, they have their own agenda. So do you see here a problem that even though now communications allow us to be, let's say, virtually around the world, so the world seems to be more coherent, but politically it seems to be more divided?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing slowly is a situation whereby we're moving towards sort of post-European hegemony. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think that's kind of, everyone's kind of anticipated this for a few decades. And I think that's something which you have to take into account. The idea that effectively large parts of the world don't need Europe anymore. And I think that's probably means that a lot of countries where a conflict within Europe would have had implications on them 50 or 60 years, 70 years ago, let's say. I think that conflict in Europe had global implications 70 years ago. Now a conflict in Europe, it still has global implications, actually, but maybe not in the same way. And I think that, you know, you see that in a situation with, say, South Africa, which is in this situation whereby it's kind of being a little bit closer to Russia, and you don't really understand why. You have a lot of people in, I mean, you can give some reasons, but in South America, they don't seem to be too interested in what's going on with the Ukraine conflict. Of course, China's being quite neutral. India is not wanting too much to antagonize Russia. So there is this kind of feeling that although, you know, for us here in Europe, there is a moral reason to support Ukraine's defense, and there is also a political reason to do it, and even a self-interested reason to do it. That's not felt everywhere, and I think that's a lot of that's due to Russia's embedded diplomatic heritage within a lot of countries. A lot of it's to do with trade. And a lot of it's to do with Soviet kind of background as well. But I think that's kind of up to a lot of that. I don't know how to solve. I don't know how to solve that.
Michael, you is a very experienced journal. You are a very experienced journal, so I would like to hear your assessment about the following issue. So what I noticed that now we really have a very serious crisis of journalism, crisis of media. First of all, because of the general level of knowledge of journalists and very low level access for profession. Because before, if you want to be a journalist, at least you had to have education, there were less media, so there was a bigger selection. Now, many people can access journalism across the board. So you see, if you look, let's say, to Times now and Times 50 years ago, it's two different newspapers. And it's not only about time, etc., etc. So there is an old-fashioned expression, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So eventually journalists now rely either on, let's say, businessmen, oligarchs, not only in Ukraine, let's say Italy. Berlusconi, who passed away, he owned several media outlets. Or they rely on ideology, they rely on state. So eventually journalists seem to have, let's say, lack of freedom, that eventually journalists lose their objectivity, so they become very tenders. So and also, let's say, they even depend upon public, because if public demand hate speech, then journalists have to pursue hate speech, you know. So what to do in this situation? How to restore media freedom, because it deals with public safety eventually.
I think that what's happened, like 15 years ago, there was a sort of rise of citizen journalism, and there was a rise in crowdfunded journalism. New forms of journalism are coming out. There's a lot of, it was usually very personal based, a lot about kind of bloggers and people going to places with cameras and filming and saying, look, I'm in a funny place. Look what's going on here. Isn't it crazy? And I think that in some ways that was good, because it broke down the kind of barriers that journalism had before. It kind of created new modes of expression. It created new media, which was very good in some ways. In other ways, it kind of made a lot of professionals question whether or not they were doing their jobs properly, because they weren't getting through to enough people, that they maybe were stuck in the same jobs for 20 years. It made them actually question a lot of the assumptions that they had about their profession, which was good. I think that what's happened since is that there's been a kind of realignment. And what you've seen is a lot of the brands which were kind of under threat 10, 15 years ago have now found business models which are functional, particularly the big ones in America, like the Washington Post or the New York Times in particular, say, or even the Times in the UK. So, I mean, these kind of things there's been a certain realignment now. I think that the problem that you have is a problem that has always existed, which is the fact that, you know, journalists are badly paid, always been badly paid. And, you know, how can they top up their income, you know, has been a problem which we've certainly seen in a lot of countries. And I think that's still with us. And I don't really know how that's going to change. I think that what you need a kind of transparent revenue streams, so transparent forms of financing for journalism. That's essentially what you need. Either crowd-funded or you make it clear who's financing projects and that kind of thing. I think that's the only way you can do it. And I think that, you know, some people might not be happy with who's financing you, but then you can have that debate. You can say, look, okay. I mean, I've had the debate where I've done a project before where it was financed by the Open Society. And of course, some people jumped on it and said, oh, you're financed by George Soros, whatever. But, you know, we were clear about that. It was easy to find out. So it's not, the issue is not essentially, the issue again is going back to transparency. That's the sort of essential part of everything you do within your profession.
Michael, thank you very much for this interview. I really grateful for this interview, for the time you spent, and I hope that in the future we also have such interesting interviews. And for our audience, I would like to remind that today we had Michael Bьорд, a very prominent British journalist who now reside in Romania, and who is working with his international team on different projects Actually, you can Google it or find on Mr. Bьорд's LinkedIn, and it's really very interesting and high-class research and high-class investigation attacks. It's true. So thank you very much. Maybe it was a sign that we met each other in the bookstore, because let's say from your level of journalism, it is obvious that a bookstore is a very important place for you. Thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, have a great day.